I never thought a guy walking dogs in my building could turn my whole stupidly predictable life upside down. But here we are. It started with him just being that background guy, the one who showed up every morning, letting a half dozen dogs out of the lobby, leash chaos happening, barking everywhere, and me trying to sip my coffee without choking. His name's Eli, though I didn't know that at first. I just knew he had this kind of chill, sun-bleached hair that looked like he'd spent half his life outside, even though he was always rocking these oversized hoodies that made him look like he was trying to hide from the world. I'm Mike, by the way. Mid-20s, kinda stuck in a job I don't hate but don't love either. Living alone in this cramped apartment on the 4th floor of this aging building in Brooklyn. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business but barely talks to each other. The only real excitement I get is watching Eli wrangle those dogs every morning. Like clockwork, rain or shine, he's out there, looking totally unfazed while the rest of us are fumbling with our keys and trying not to get trampled by a golden retriever. So yeah, Eli was basically my daily dose of, whoa, that's kinda cool, in a sea of boring. I noticed him more than I probably should have, like the way his laugh was low and genuine, or how he'd always give the dogs these little nicknames that made them perk up instantly. I'm not exactly the guy who flirts or makes moves, but there was something about him that made my chest weirdly tight whenever he locked eyes with me for a split second. I figured it was just one of those dumb crushes you get on someone who's completely out of your league. Then came last Thursday night. I was sitting on my couch, half watching some rerun and lazily scrolling through my phone when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. That's the thing about living alone and working late shifts. The knock came again, harder this time, and it was definitely someone who wasn't just the usual, "Hello, can I borrow some sugar, neighbor?" I opened the door a crack, and there he was. Eli. But this time, no hoodie, no t-shirt, just bare skin from the waist up. His chest was dusted with freckles, and I could see faint scratches along his arms like he'd been wrestling with the dogs or maybe something else. His hair was damp, sticking to his forehead, and his eyes were wide but kind of intense. I swear, in that moment, I forgot how to breathe. "I need help," he said, voice low and urgent. That's when I realized this wasn't just the casual dog walker from earlier that day. Something was seriously off, and suddenly, the guy who had always been a blurry, easy smile in the hallway was standing right in front of me, raw and real, breaking every rule I'd ever set for myself about keeping my distance. And honestly, I had no idea what I was about to get myself into. I blinked a couple of times, trying to process the situation. Help with what? I finally managed to say, stepping back to let him in. My apartment wasn't big, so there wasn't much room to hesitate. Eli didn't bother with small talk or waiting for an invitation. He just slipped inside like he'd been living there all along. I shut the door behind him, and that's when I noticed the smell, kind of a mix of rain, sweat, and something faintly like dog shampoo. It was weirdly comforting in a way. Eli ran a hand through his damp hair, looking a little embarrassed, maybe grateful I'd let him in without asking questions. One of the dogs got loose. Max, he's this huge golden retriever from the building, ran off, and I chased him into the park. Then I slipped, fell, and tore my shirt. Plus, I think I messed up my ankle. I was already moving to the couch, grabbing the first aid kit from a makeshift shelf. His bare chest was still exposed, and I noticed the scratches I'd missed before, longer ones, some looking almost angry, mixed with smaller scrapes. Ankle, huh? Let me see. I sat down, then gestured for him to sit next to me, but he stayed standing, shifting his weight awkwardly. He rolled up his sleeves, and I could see a nasty bruise forming just above his ankle bone. "Yeah, that's gonna need some ice, and you might want to keep it elevated." I grabbed one of those cheap frozen peas packs from my freezer, wrapped it in a towel, and handed it to him. "Here, you can sit now." He hesitated, then lowered himself onto the couch, wincing as he adjusted his position. "Thanks," he muttered. For a moment, we just sat there in silence. Me watching him, trying to figure out what to say next, and Eli staring at the floor like he was trying to decide if he should disappear. Finally, I asked, "Wait, so Max got loose? How did that happen?" He sighed. "I swear I had them all leashed, but the gate to the yard was open. I didn't notice. Max took off after some squirrel or something, and the rest followed. I smiled despite myself. Classic Max. He looked up, and there was this spark in his eyes, like suddenly we'd crossed some invisible line. Yeah, classic Max. He's trouble, but I swear he's got a good heart. I laughed. A real laugh. The kind that feels like it's been stuck somewhere and finally breaks free. Maybe it was the way Eli looked so vulnerable, or maybe it was just the absurdity of the whole situation. Either way, the ice was breaking. So, you've been walking the dogs here long? I asked, trying to keep things casual. Almost a year. His voice was softer now. It's a good gig. Gets me outside. Keeps me moving. Plus I get to meet all the weird neighbors. He smirked. Like you. I raised an eyebrow. Weird, huh? Yeah, weird, but in a good way. You're always polite, but kind of locked in your own world. That hit closer than I wanted to admit. I shrugged. I'm working on it. We both laughed again, and for a moment I forgot about the bruised ankle and the soaked hair and the fact that this stranger had just knocked on my door shirtless in the middle of the night. Then he looked up at me, and I swear I could see the flicker of something unspoken between us. Can I stay here for a bit? Just until my ankle feels better? He asked quietly. I nodded before I even realized I was doing it. Yeah, of course. He settled in, leaning back on the couch, and I fetched a blanket from the closet. I draped it over his shoulders, feeling my own heartbeat speed up a little more than it should. As the night wore on, we talked about dogs, about the building, about stupid things and serious things. I learned he'd moved to New York a couple of years ago, chasing some half-formed dream that hadn't quite worked out yet. That he liked to draw but rarely showed anyone his sketches. That he missed his family but didn't want to admit it. And me? I shared a little too, more than I usually would with anyone I barely knew. By the time the city outside started to quiet, and the dogs were safely back inside their apartments, something had shifted between us. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, just this quiet understanding that neither of us was as alone as we thought. When I finally looked over at Eli, he was asleep on my couch, the blanket pulled up to his chin, his chest rising and falling steadily. His ankle was propped on a pillow, and the scratches somehow looked less menacing in the soft glow of the streetlights filtering through the window. I sat there for a while, watching him, wondering what the hell had just happened and what it meant. And then, just before I turned out the light, I realized I wanted to see him again. Not just as the dog walker or the guy who crashed my night, but as something more. But how do you even start with that? When the whole thing began with a knock on your door, no shirt, and a busted ankle? I had no idea. All I knew was that this was the beginning of something I wasn't ready to put a label on yet. Something that felt like maybe, just maybe, could change everything. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, hitting Eli's face just right so I could see his eyes flutter open before he even stirred. He looked disoriented for a second, probably trying to remember where he was. Then his gaze landed on me sitting awkwardly at the edge of the couch, half worried, half amused. Morning, I said, voice a little too casual for the situation. Morning. He gave me a tired smile, stretching his arms above his head, which made me realize he was still shirtless under the blanket. Thanks for letting me crash here last night. I owe you. I waved that off, but inside I was trying not to let my mind wander in a direction it definitely wanted to go. Like, what was this? A second chance at something I never thought I'd have? Or was I just setting myself up to get hurt? So how's the ankle? I asked, standing up to get some water. Better. Still hurts like hell, though. He sounded like he was trying to sound tough, but honestly, I could tell the pain was real. We sat around, sipping coffee, and I realized how little I knew about Eli beyond the dog walker shtick. I mean, I knew his name now, but that was about it. So I decided to ask, what's your story, Eli? Like, what made you leave wherever you were before and end up here? He paused, looking down at his hands. It's kind of a long story. Long stories are the best kind. He chuckled softly. I guess I was trying to find a place where I could breathe. I grew up in a small town, pretty conservative. Coming out wasn't easy, and I didn't exactly have a lot of support. Moving here was supposed to be a fresh start. I nodded, understanding more than I probably let on. New York has that reputation for being a city where you can disappear and become whoever you want, but it doesn't always erase the past. Sounds like this city's been good to you so far? He shrugged. It's complicated. Some days, yeah. Other days, it's just lonely. That hit close to home. I knew that feeling all too well. Hey, I said, reaching out to lightly bump his arm. If you ever need to talk or just hang out, I'm around, and I promise I'm not as weird as the building gossip. He smiled, a little shy now. Thanks, Mike. Before I could ask him about the dogs or how he managed to keep so many leashed at once, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then frowned. That's my boss. I should probably get going, make sure everything's okay with the dogs. I stood up too, feeling this weird reluctance to let him go. Want me to help you? I'm terrible with dogs, but I can carry stuff or something. He laughed, a genuine laugh that made my chest tighten. Thanks, but I'll manage. I'm probably going to be limping around for a while, though. We headed to the door together, and just before he stepped out, he turned back. Hey, Mike, maybe you can come meet the pack sometime? They're not all chaos, I swear. I grinned. Deal. After he left, I closed the door and leaned against it, trying to shake off this sudden mix of excitement and nerves. It was wild how one night, one knock, could change the whole vibe of your day. Over the next few days, Eli and I bumped into each other a little more often. Sometimes in the lobby, sometimes on the street outside. Each time, the conversations got a little longer, a little more personal. He showed me pictures of the dogs on his phone, and I told him about my failed attempts at cooking. We laughed at dumb jokes and shared stories that made the building feel a bit less anonymous. One afternoon, I caught him sitting on the fire escape, sketchbook in hand, shading something with careful strokes. I hesitated, then asked if I could see. He handed it over, and I was surprised by how good it was. Portraits of the dogs, quick sketches of people on the subway, even a detailed drawing of the building's old brick facade. Why don't you show this to more people? I asked. Because it's personal, he said softly. And because I'm scared it's not good enough. I looked up at him, feeling an urge to tell him that his art was amazing and that the only thing not good enough was his self-doubt. But instead, I just said, I'd like to see more someday. He smiled, and it felt like a secret passed between us. That night, I found myself waiting by the window, watching for Eli to come back from his dog walking route. When he finally showed up, I opened the door without knocking. It was like I didn't want to lose whatever momentum we'd built. He looked surprised but pleased, and when I said, "Want to grab a drink?" "My treat," he nodded. We ended up at this tiny bar down the street, the kind of place with dim lights and music that's just loud enough to make you lean in closer. We talked for hours, about everything and nothing. He told me about the first time he walked Max, the dog who'd gotten loose, and how terrified he was that day. I told him about the last breakup that left me wondering if I'd ever want to try again. There was no pressure, no big declarations, just two people figuring each other out over cheap beer and the hum of city life. As we stepped outside into the chilly night air, Eli looked at me and said, "Thanks for tonight. I don't usually do this sort of thing." Me neither, I admitted, but maybe we should do it again. He smiled and I caught a flicker of something, hope, maybe, before he winked and said, "Definitely." Walking back to the building side by side, I realized that sometimes the best stories come from the most unexpected knocks at your door. And maybe, just maybe, this was the start of a story I actually wanted to be a part of. After that night at the bar, things between Eli and me started to slide into this weird, comfortable rhythm. Not quite defined, but definitely more than casual hellos in the hallway. We weren't officially a thing, at least I didn't think so, but there was something electric every time our conversation stretched past the usual small talk. A few days later, I found myself standing awkwardly in the lobby, waiting for Eli to finish his morning dog walking shift. He showed up with a handful of leashes, a tired smile, and a scruffy golden retriever in tow. Max was wearing his usual, "Look at me, I'm adorable" expression, his tongue lolling out like he'd just run a marathon. "Hey," Eli said, dropping Max's leash on the floor. "You ready to meet the chaos?" I laughed, feeling a little more at ease than usual. "As ready as I'll ever be." We headed down to the small courtyard behind the building, where a handful of dogs were gathered, sniffing, running in circles, and occasionally barking at nothing in particular. It was pure chaos, like a furry storm, but Eli moved through it like a pro, calm, patient, completely in control. "Okay," he said, handing me a leash. "Meet Luna." A small black and white terrier immediately bounced up, tail wagging like crazy. I crouched down, letting her sniff my hand, and she promptly licked my fingers like I was the best thing she'd smelled all day. "She's a little ball of energy," Eli warned, "but she's sweet." We spent the next half hour walking around the block, the dogs pulling and tugging, Eli giving me tips on how to handle each one. I was terrible at it, but he didn't make me feel incompetent, just gently guided me with a smile. After that walk, we ended up back in my apartment where Eli plopped down on the couch, clearly exhausted but grinning like a kid who'd just won a prize. "You're not half bad," he teased. I rolled my eyes, feeling that weird mix of pride and embarrassment. "Thanks, I think." We settled into this easy silence, the kind that doesn't feel awkward but kind of warm. Then he looked over at me, eyes searching. "Mike, can I ask you something?" he said quietly. "Shoot. Do you ever feel like you're stuck? Like you want to change things but don't know how?" I nodded, more than I wanted to admit. "Yeah, all the time." He smiled softly. "Me too." That night, we talked until the city lights outside faded behind the dawn. I told him about my fears of never finding someone who really gets me. He told me about the nights he spent alone, wishing for something more than just walking dogs and drifting. And somewhere between the confessions and the laughter, I realized this was no longer just a crush or a fleeting thing. Eli was becoming someone I wanted to fight for, someone I wanted to be vulnerable with. But just as things were starting to feel right, life threw a curveball. A few weeks later, Eli got a call from his old neighborhood, a family emergency. He needed to go back home, maybe for a while, maybe longer. The uncertainty hit me like a punch, but I tried to hide it. "I have to go," he said one evening, sitting across from me on my couch, the weight of the news heavy between us. "When?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Tomorrow morning." We didn't talk much after that, just sat in silence, the kind that says more than words ever could. "I'll come back," he promised. I don't know when, but I will. I wanted to believe him, but the knot in my stomach didn't loosen. The next morning, I watched him leave, suitcase in hand, the sunlight catching the edges of his hair one last time before he disappeared down the stairs. I stood there, alone in the quiet of my apartment, wondering if this was how our story ended, or if it was just another beginning. The apartment felt emptier than I ever remembered it being. Without Eli's chaotic dog pack and his easy laughter filling the halls, the silence was almost deafening. Days passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had left with him. I kept staring at my phone, half expecting a message, a meme, anything, but the screen stayed stubbornly blank. I tried distracting myself, work, binge-watching shows, even attempting to cook a decent meal, which ended in the smoke detector screaming and me ordering pizza. But none of it mattered, because every little thing reminded me of Eli somehow. The way the dogs used to bark in the morning, the sketchbook he left behind when he packed in a hurry, the faint scent of rain and something earthy that still lingered on his hoodie. One night, about a week after he left, I found myself standing by the window, staring out at the rain streaking down the glass. My phone buzzed suddenly, and my heart jumped. It was a text from an unknown number. "Hey, it's Eli. Sorry for the silence. Things have been intense here. Miss you." I stared at the message, my fingers trembling, then quickly typed back, "I miss you too. Everything okay?" His reply came almost instantly. "Better now. Can we talk? Tomorrow?" I didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." The next day, we talked for hours over video chat. He told me about the chaos waiting for him back home, the family struggles, the old wounds reopening, but also about the relief of being with people who knew his story. I told him about the empty mornings, the sketchbook gathering dust, the dogs missing their usual walks. There was a pause, and then Eli said, "Mike, I don't want this to be a goodbye. Not for real." Neither did I. After that call, we started texting almost every day, sharing the small moments, the good and the bad. He sent me photos of his dog walking routes, sketches of the old neighborhood, and occasionally selfies with the faintest smile. It wasn't the same as having him here, but it was something. It was hope. Months passed, and I found myself counting down to the day Eli said he'd be back. The building felt less like home without him, and I realized how much I'd come to rely on his presence, even in the smallest ways. Then, one chilly afternoon, I heard the familiar jingle of the building door. I was standing by the window when I saw him, walking slowly, leaning a little on a cane, but with that same sun-bleached hair and those eyes that had haunted my dreams. Eli, I breathed, almost not believing it. He grinned, tired but triumphant. Miss me? I didn't answer. Instead, I threw the door open and pulled him inside, feeling like, this time, we were really home. As we stood there, the city buzzing around us, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just another chapter, a messy, beautiful, real chapter we'd write together, one day at a time. After I closed the door behind Eli, I leaned against it for a moment, just staring at him like I couldn't quite believe he was actually here. He looked exhausted, more than I expected, and the cane was a clear reminder that whatever he'd been through back home hadn't been easy. But damn, seeing him standing there, a little unsteady but smiling, made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't anticipated. I'm really back, he said, breaking the silence with that easy grin that had hooked me from the start. For real this time. I laughed, a little breathless. Good, because I was about to start sending out search parties. He rolled his eyes, but didn't protest. So what's new around here, besides me finally not being a ghost? I shrugged, suddenly aware of how quiet the apartment felt with just the two of us. Not much. The usual rat race, but I missed the chaos. And the dogs. Definitely the dogs. Eli gave a small smile, then winced and shifted his weight, the cane pressing into the floor. My ankle's still healing. Took a while to get to a doctor back home. Guess I'm not as invincible as I thought. I motioned for him to sit down, but before he could, there was a loud bark and a chaotic scramble from the hallway. Without thinking, I opened the door a crack, just as Max, the golden retriever, barreled in, tail wagging like a helicopter blade. Max, what are you doing in here? Eli laughed, the sound warm and genuine, the kind that fills the spaces you didn't know needed filling. Max hopped up, nearly knocking Eli over, and the two of them shared this easy moment like they hadn't been apart for months. I stepped back, watching them, feeling this bubble of happiness that was almost too big to contain. So, Eli said, finally turning to me, I brought something. He reached into his bag and pulled out the sketchbook he'd left behind before he left. It was a little worn around the edges, but the pages were filled with drawings, of dogs, of the neighborhood, and even a few portraits I hadn't seen before. Thought you might want this back, he said, handing it over. I flipped through the pages, noticing one tucked near the front that caught my eye. A quick sketch of two figures sitting side by side on a fire escape. One figure had this unmistakable mop of hair that looked a lot like me. Is this us? I asked. A little unsure. Eli nodded, cheeks coloring a bit. Yeah, the night we went to that bar. I've been carrying that moment around with me. I felt my throat tighten. That was a good night. Best night, he agreed. We sat there for a while, the city noises drifting in through the open window, the dog settling down in a pile near the door. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't feel lonely, but like a promise. Over the next few days, Eli settled back into the building's rhythm. He was slower on his feet, but he still managed to wrangle the dogs with that same effortless charm. I found myself volunteering to help more than I ever expected, even if it just meant holding leashes or handing out treats. One evening, after a particularly chaotic walk, Eli and I ended up back in my apartment, exhausted but laughing over some ridiculous dog antic. I forgot how loud this place gets, he said, shaking his head. Wait until Max decides to serenade the neighbors at 6 a.m., I teased. He smiled, then his expression softened. Mike, I've been thinking about us. I held my breath, heart pounding. I don't want to just slip back into something casual. I want more. If you're up for it. I didn't hesitate. I want that too. It felt like the weight of months of uncertainty lifted in an instant. From that night on, things slowly started to change. We were no longer just neighbors or accidental friends. We became a team. Messy, imperfect, but real. We faced challenges. His ankle healing slower than expected. The occasional tension from past fears and doubts. But we tackled them together, like we'd somehow found a way to fill the gaps we both carried. One night, months after he moved back in for good, I found myself standing in the kitchen, watching Eli sketch at the table, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows across his face. The dogs were curled up nearby, and the city hummed outside our window. I realized then how much my life had shifted, from the boring, predictable routine I'd settled into, to this beautiful, unpredictable mess of love and laughter, and it all started with a knock on my door. No shirt, bruised, and desperate for help. Sometimes, the best stories begin when you least expect them. It wasn't some grand gesture or cinematic moment that made me realize how deep this had gotten. It was a quiet evening. Just Eli and me and a chorus of soft snores from the dogs sprawled across the living room floor. We were sitting side by side on the couch, sharing a blanket and a bottle of cheap wine I'd picked up because it felt like the right kind of night for it. Eli was sketching, the pencil moving smoothly across the page. Every now and then he'd glance up at me, smile that half-shy, half-sure smile, and go back to shading in the lines. I watched him, thinking about how far we'd come, from a shirtless knock on my door to this calm, steady presence I couldn't imagine my days without. "Hey," he said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Yeah? I just wanted to say thanks. For that night, for letting me crash, and for sticking around when things got messy." I shrugged, feeling that familiar warm pull in my chest. "You don't owe me anything." "I'm glad you came back." His eyes caught mine, and for a second, everything else faded. The city noise, the dogs, the endless swirl of life outside our little bubble. "You know," he said, "I wasn't sure if this was real. If people like me could really find someone who gets it, who gets me." I reached over, took his hand in mine. "I get you, and I'm here. Not because it's easy, but because it's worth it." He squeezed my hand gently, a quiet promise passing between us. Later, when the night deepened and the dogs finally settled into full sleep mode, Eli curled up next to me. His head found its familiar spot on my shoulder, and I rested my cheek against his hair. It felt like home. In that moment, I realized that love isn't always fireworks or perfect scenes. Sometimes it's the little things. Showing up, staying after the hard parts, the quiet understanding that you're not alone anymore, and honestly, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Because sometimes, all it takes is one unexpected knock to change everything.